the Hague
Kia
Initiative
ora,
for
talofa
International
lava.
A
Cooperation.
very important
And almost every
From the
language
Israel
other than
Institute of New
English
Zealand.
and
My
French.
roots come from Jerusalem.
So, good evening. My name is Ashley Church, and this is the Israel Report. And I'm joined this evening again, as I normally am, by Dr. David Cumin. And we're going to be talking tonight about this is the third part of our series on our voter guide. And tonight we're going to be talking about individual candidates within the main political parties and their attitudes toward Israel. But before I do that, I'm going to introduce David. And I want to just talk briefly, David. Last week or a couple of weeks ago when we did our last Israel report, we talked about particularly about the policies of Billy TK from the Advanced New Zealand Party and just some of the concerns that we had about some of the things that Billy was saying. And it appears that there's been some development since that took place. So what I thought we'd do is before we started talking about candidates from the main parties, just talk a little bit about what's actually taken place and perhaps your perspective on that.
Yeah, sure. So I'd encourage anyone that missed the last episode to go back and have a listen. Dr. Cherie Trotter, myself and Ashley looked at Billy TK and what he has been saying, particularly about Israel and Zionism. We reached out to him again on the back of that. Some of his supporters encouraged us to do that, and we did. It's been quite disappointing. He hasn't engaged with us at all. But then he wrote something on his Facebook page. So his social media account seems to be the way that he wants to communicate. And it wasn't quite the engagement that I think we would have liked. No. He basically doubled down on his anti-Zionism. He said that I would like to clarify my political stance on political Israel, in quotes. Much of what these accusations are based on have been my views about the Zionist political system that at times has embodied supremacist thought and separatist behavior and in no way refers to the Israel people or those with Jewish heritage. So, look, I think this is a well-trodden trope of trying to say that Zionism has nothing to do with Judaism, and he's obviously still on this line of thinking that Zionism is evil. And it's really disappointing. We would be more than open to sitting down with Billy and having a chat about his ideas and trying to educate him a little bit. I think we'll leave it at that for now, and let's move on to some of the other MPs who hopefully have more of a chance of getting in.
Good stuff. Thanks for that, David. So what we're going to do this evening is we're going to have a chat about, so just to go back through what we've done over the last 2 or 3 weeks. The first episode was on the policies of the major political parties, in fact, the policies of all of the parties on Israel. Last week, as we just indicated, we talked about Billy TK. What we're going to do tonight is we're going to talk a little bit about some of the individual MPs in Parliament and their responses and attitudes toward Israel. And so, David, I thought what we might do is maybe, although this isn't based on party political positions, what we might do is maybe start with the National Party and then work our way through. So, floor's yours.
Sure. Well, I mean, 3 National Party candidates stand out for all the right reasons, as far as we're concerned. The first one, who I think deserves to be first, is Alfred Naro. And I'm just going to put in the chat of this Zoom a link to a video that you might want to watch afterwards. He made a video with us where he affirmed his Zionism. He made an I am a Zionist video with us. So I'd encourage you to watch that video if you haven't seen it already. I think Alfred Naro is got to be the best friend that Israel has in our current government. He restarted the New Zealand-Israel Parliamentary Friendship Group and repeatedly committed his support for Israel. So Alfred Naro, unfortunately, has been bumped down the list, so he will only get back in if he wins his Te Atatū seat at the moment. But as far as Israel is concerned, Alfred is right up there and a great place to start, I think. Did you have anything to add, Ashley?
Oh, no, only as you say, he's an amazing advocate and supporter of Israel. He's become increasingly so over this term of government, or perhaps it's been because I've had more to do with them, but I've certainly found that he's been a very vocal supporter. He's as you say the I guess the glue of that parliamentary supporters group. And like you, very, very disappointed to see that drop in his ranking. I'm not sure what's behind that. It would be easy to draw some sort of insidious agenda, but I don't think that's the case. And so let's just hope that he does well in the forthcoming elections in that seat that he's currently representing.
Yeah, and I think not far behind Alfred in the support for Israel stakes in the National Party is Simon O'Connor, MP for Tamaki. He has also done a video with us that I'll put in the chat. And he and Todd McClay, who's the other National Party MP who stands out positively, have both advocated that the embassy to Israel from New Zealand is moved from Turkey to Israel. And this, of course, makes all the sense in the world. It is, frankly, an insult that our ambassador to Israel is based in Turkey, which is not the friendliest of nations towards Israel. And so, Simon and Todd beating that drum, I think all power to them. And it's great to see that advocacy from our MPs.
Couldn't agree more. Who's next on your list?
Well, I'd broken it down slightly differently. Rather than by party, I'd done the good, bad, and the good, the bad, and the ugly. But it kind of works. Kind of. I guess if we move from national, the only other person in national I think that deserves a slight mention are two people. One is Simon Bridges.
Yes.
For apologising for UN Security Council Resolution 2334 and the role that New Zealand played in that. So Alfred also did, but I think given that Simon was the leader at the time, it was him that first said sorry, and that is very welcomed. And the other person is Jerry Brownlee, who worked behind the scenes to re-establish ties after that resolution and after the Israeli ambassador was recalled. So,
in fact, I'd probably be a little bit more strong in my view on that than you. I think Brownlee's actually been a much better friend than perhaps we give him credit for. And as you say, he did play quite a strong role behind the scenes afterward. And as I understand it, a fairly forceful one. So I think, it's possible that Brownlee plays perhaps a more nuanced role when it comes to the way that he actually appears on the issue. But I think he's been a very strong supporter, and he deserves our credit for that.
Yeah, I think so. Not many people would know that, and there's not a lot publicly that would indicate it, which is part of the reason that he's not on our voters' guide, but important to talk about nonetheless.
So let's go to the Labor Party. Let's talk about the MPs within the Labor Party who've taken either a pro or a negative view toward Israel, and maybe just make an assessment of that.
Well, look, I wish I could tell you that there was a Labor Party MP that was positively disposed to Israel openly. That's not the case, unfortunately. And what we have in the Labor Party is a bad and an ugly. The bad is really bad, unfortunately. And for those who don't know, Dr. Duncan Webb is the MP for Christchurch Central. He is an open supporter of the boycott, divestment and sanctions campaign against Israel. And he has hosted Mike Treen when he came back from his flotilla boat trip to support Hamas. He supports the Palestinian Solidarity Network Aotearoa group that is headed by John Minto, and the secretary is Neil Scott. And these are two people who have made and tolerated grossly anti-Semitic comments online. This is really disappointing from a Labor Party MP. He also, in a public meeting down in Christchurch, said that a strong Zionist Jewish lobby controls US politics. So when I say bad, it's really, really bad, unfortunately.
David, it's worth mentioning that you and I actually visited Dr. Webb about a year ago in Parliament, and gave him the opportunity maybe just to explain some of those views and to get some perspective on where he came from. And for me, I came away from that meeting pretty much with a reinforced view of where he actually stood and the unreasonableness of his position. Yeah,
look, I went in with an open mind. He extended the invitation after we challenged him hosting Mike Treen for lunch.
That's right.
He didn't host us for lunch, but he hosted us in his office. And, if someone's open to dialogue, I think that's the best way to get across. But it was pretty apparent, I think, to both of us and anyone else in the room that was listening, that he had his views. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Ashley, but he ended the meeting by saying something like, as a backbencher of a small country, I want to make my mark on the world, something like that. So
something along those lines, yes.
Yeah, so it even seems like part of his motivation for supporting the groups that he supports and the campaigns that he supports is some sort of ego-driven as well.
Hubris, I think, is the word.
Yeah, well, yes. So look, let's. There's plenty to read up on Duncan Webb on our website. For anyone that's interested in more, let us know. But it is really bad, and the ugly side of that, to me, is. The leaders of the Labour Party have done nothing. So we've written to the senior whip and the Prime Minister, the leader of the Labour Party, and neither of them have been willing to condemn Dr. Webb's discrimination by supporting BDS.
David, you have a better idea of this than me because you follow such things. But if we were to go back 15 or 20 years and look at the Friends of Israel group in Parliament, perhaps 20 years ago, I believe that the political composition, cross-party composition would have been quite different.
Yeah, I think so. I think it was much more bipartisanly supported. It's worth noting that Dr. Webb has joined that group. He's also said that he thinks it should be the Parliamentary Friends of Israel and Palestine, although he doesn't think that there should be a Parliamentary Friends of China and Taiwan, for example, which just shows a little bit of his double standards to my eyes. But yeah, this is increasingly a real problem, I think, and this is one of the biggest issues I think that that we face is the partisanship nature of attitudes towards Israel.
Increasingly so.
Increasingly so. This polarization is really deeply concerning, and you would think of all parties, a Labour, a left of centre government should be the most predisposed to Israel, given the indigenous nature of Jews to the land. The Zionism is a liberation movement, the only liberal democratic country in the Middle East. All of these things you would think are liberal values, even back to the establishment and the socialist nature of the kibbutzim movement, etc. Unfortunately, that's drifted a lot. And there's a lot of whys and wherefores about that, but post 67, I think, was a big turning point. And now we're in the unfortunate position of, in New Zealand, having an MP from Labour who openly supports a discriminatory and racist campaign and is not sanctioned by his leaders.
It's interesting you should make that point. I think I've talked in the Israel report before about the book Making David into Goliath, and it makes exactly the same point. That if you go back to the period around 67, even into the early 70s, that Israel was very much the darling of the left. And the reason for that, I think at least partly, was because of the kibbutz movement and the fact that it was a sort of socialist economy, or its origins were. But the two have certainly parted company since the 70s and become entrenched enemies, I suppose, for want of a better word. But David, let's move now to New Zealand first.
Yeah, well, the only kind of member in there falls into the ugly category, Winston Peters, and ugly because he's been foreign minister, and as foreign minister, he hasn't made any comment about New Zealand funding extremism. The $1 million at least that New Zealand gives to UNRWA each year, that partly goes to teaching children to hate and incites violence, has been nothing that he wants to comment on. We know that he was briefed in March by MFAT. We've got those documents recently published, and he has been completely silent on the matter, and that's pretty ugly, if you ask me. There is a slight silver lining to that grey cloud, though. He really was at the forefront of apologising when the immigration ministry published the maps that erased Israel. So I don't know if anyone remembers that, but Winston Peters front-footed that quite well, I thought, and made the apology. It's also noteworthy that he, or New Zealand First, got into the coalition agreement a line about UN 2334 saying that the right protocol in New Zealand wasn't followed. So there's some silver lining, but overall it's pretty ugly.
Great. What do we know about ACT's position, David Seymour?
Yeah, David doesn't really fit into any of these groups, to be honest. He's been pretty silent on the issues of Israel. But if you talk to him privately, he's a supporter. He's hosted the ambassador a number of times. He's been very open and warm and welcomed by the Jewish community and has spoken well of Israel. I think he gets it. He gets that Israel is, a shining beacon of democracy in a pretty rough part of the world, and that's his position, but he's not openly going to speak one way or the other, or he hasn't at least yet. So he's quietly beavering away. I think he's a quiet supporter, but that's about all we can say, I think. Do you know anything else?
No, in fact, you've just said more than I knew, so there you go. I've just learned something. And that brings us to the highlight, which is the extreme views of at least a couple of MPs in the Green Party.
Yeah, look, the Greens have been problematic for a little while. They have been almost all around the world. So Marama Davidson joining the flotilla was not her proudest moment in the eyes of many people, although she might disagree with that. She's been quite, she stands by her decision. But really, it was pretty sad to see a New Zealand MP of any colour jumping on a ship with people who have created video games to kill Israelis and have blamed Israel for the Munich attacks, for example, to go on a boat trip to support Hamas. So that's Marama. She's now the co-leader. That was a little while ago. And the other notable mention in the Green Party, I think, is Golriz Garaman, who falsely suggested that Israel was committing, quote, genocide and apartheid at one stand-up. And this is coming from someone who defended a person on charges of genocide at the UN. So she should know what she's talking about, and clearly wasn't. And then shortly after that, she falsely said that Jesus' mother, Mary, was a Palestinian, of all things. So confused, I don't think, is the right word for it, because she's an intelligent woman. She's got some good degrees. She's done some very good work. And the only silver lining to her story is that she kind of apologized for the last one and hasn't really said much since. So I would put that in the bad category. What about you, Ashley?
No, I'm with you on both of those. In fact, we do a presentation or an address around the country which deals with attitudes toward Israel, and it's in 3 sections. The first section being, or the second section being the media, the third section being the public, but the first section is politicians, and quite a bit of it's devoted to those two individuals, Marama and Golriz, for the reasons that you've articulated. And it's unfortunate because these aren't green issues either. These are very much issues at the vanguard of the left of those who attack Israel. Unfortunately, I have a question for you, and the question's this: so we've gone through, rough count in my head, probably 9 or 10 people of a 120 MP Parliament currently, which means that by inference we don't know what the positions are of the other 110, 109 odd of those MPs.
Well, there is one more, I think, before you get onto your question, Ashley, and that is the leader of the other co-leader of the Green Party, James Shaw.
Right.
So there's a couple of comments I think are important to make with regard to him. We had a meeting with him a long time ago, and he actually does understand the traditional green environmental policies and how Israel can help with that, because of course Israel is one of the leaders in renewable energy and recycling and green tech, and James got that. He thought that was a really useful possible way of New Zealand to interact with Israel. And more recently, last month, he was sitting on a panel in Arrow Valley in Wellington, on a panel of MPs, and he was asked a question about whether or not if he was in, he would boycott Israel, essentially. So all the panelists were given a chance to answer this, and James was the second up, and he very clearly said that the boycott, divestment and sanctions campaign has a strong thread of anti-Semitism to it, and it's often used as a cover for anti-Semitism.
Wow.
I think that's extremely noteworthy. It also reflects what his colleagues in the Green Party in Germany did as well. They joined a bipartisan bill in Germany that equated the boycott, divestment and sanctions campaign to the boycott of Jews under Nazi Germany. So there is an understanding by at least James and his Green counterparts in Germany of the anti-Semitic nature of the BDS campaign. So look, there's a big silver lining for James Shaw. What undercuts that, unfortunately, is according to the Palestinian Solidarity Network, Aotearoa, all of the Green Party MPs signed up to their pledge, and one of the items on their pledge is to boycott Israel. So I don't quite understand what's going on there. Either James Shaw is saying, I'm an anti-Semite and I don't care, or he is...
misrepresented by the network.
Or he's misrepresented, or he just doesn't understand what he's signing up to. And any of those options, I think, are pretty bad.
So the question I was going to ask you, I'm going to rephrase it in another way. So the history of single-issue parties in this country is not good. The hunting and fishing party, I think, which perennially stands elections, I think, probably gets 50 or 60 votes. The legalised cannabis party up until this election, where there's a referendum, basically, you vote for it, you waste your vote. You could make the same accusation, coming back to what I said before about there being sort of 9 MPs or 10 MPs who are identified in their views either positive or negative toward Israel. You could make the same accusation of a position on Israel as a single issue. And so I guess the question that I would ask was, does it matter? Because at the end of the day, it's not going to move the dial. People are going to vote on a whole range of other issues which have got nothing to do with Israel. And therefore, if it doesn't move the dial, why is it important?
Yeah, look, I think that's a very fair question. And I think there's a couple of points to make on that. The one is, absolutely, if when the Mana Party, for example, came out and the only foreign policy point that they had was to condemn Israel, they really could have left that off, right? They're not really about Israel. They don't really have a foreign policy package per se, and that's not part of it. So I think there is a case for some parties to ignore it, not go into it. I think David Seymour's approach is probably consistent with ACT. That doesn't really get involved with foreign policy. It doesn't really have much to say about anything that's going on unless it impacts New Zealand. So the Chinese trying to suppress the Hong Kong speech on campus, for example, those sorts of things. So I think it's a bit different when we start to talk about the bigger parties that do have a more comprehensive foreign policy, that do speak out on a number of issues. I think it also is important when we talk about MPs that are controlling the funds of New Zealand. So the foreign minister, the finance minister, the prime minister, where we're sending $1 million a year to an organisation that teaches children to hate. These are issues that are important substantively. I think it also is an issue when New Zealand is one of the only countries that doesn't designate Hezbollah as a terror organisation. That doesn't just affect Israel and Jews living there. Hezbollah has attacked Jewish targets and Israelis outside of Israel. So I think there's a whole range of reasons why the MPs should be concerned with this issue. And the final one, I think, is an overall less specific than those two examples, and that is that the Israel test is something that's been put forward, and essentially it says, look, the way that you view Israel is the way that you view a whole range of other issues. So it's almost a litmus test. You know, we can quibble about exactly the best way to structure our social welfare, our healthcare, our housing, etc. But if you miss the target on being able to say Israel is the indigenous land of the Jewish people, they have a right to self-determination there and a right to defend themselves, and you conflate terror organizations with the IDF, for example, or you say that Jesus' mother was a Palestinian, or that a strong Zionist Jewish lobby controls US politics, we're in a slippery side. And we've seen this in the UK, for example, most recently. The example of Jeremy Corbyn, I think, is one that we should bear in mind. And we're fortunate to be in New Zealand, where we've got a chance, hopefully, to shift the dial a little bit, get the train back on the right tracks, and not have it veer off into that level of hatred.
So a couple of things come out of that. The first one is I didn't know anything about the Israel, the litmus test. So that's, to me, that's the makings of an episode in its own right. So we'll have to talk about that at some point, because that sounds fascinating. But the rest of it actually segues very nicely into what I'd like to close on. We've got a few minutes left, and you'd have to have been blind not to have noticed that there's been some fairly substantial developments in the Middle East over the last 2 or 3 weeks, and a little bit longer, in fact, with some of the peace treaties being signed with the UAE and potentially with Saudi Arabia and Sudan and some other nations. And I really just wanted to get a sense of, obviously, your perspective on that, which I think I can probably guess, but also what you think the New Zealand government, given that it has been quite willing to take a position on some other issues, what the New Zealand government's position should be on that particular issue.
Yeah, sure. So I've just thrown up a couple of links in the chat for people to follow afterwards about the Israel test and related matters. Look, there's a couple of points, I think. First of all, the historic agreements between the UAE in particular and Bahrain with Israel are remarkable, because it's not just about possibly some arms sales and maybe some intelligence sharing and the common threat of Iran. While those are definitely on the table, what we've seen, particularly from the UAE, is much deeper than that. There have been sukkahs erected in the centres. They've asked hotels to cater for kosher food. There's been a real grassroots interaction of people on the ground. This, I think, is a much deeper piece than we've seen before, and that should be entirely welcomed. And it's, kudos to Winston Peters and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for welcoming it. But what it means is much more significant, I think. I hope that this is the start of many more nations that start to finally acknowledge and welcome a return of a Jewish nation in the land. An acceptance of Jewish self-determination is really what this is all about. And so the answer is quite simple. Acknowledge it, welcome it, ask for more. And I think really it's an opportunity for New Zealand officials to rethink the way that they've viewed the Middle East. Because the way that our officials have viewed the Middle East has been much more of the John Kerry type, where he said there will be no peace in Palestine until there will be no peace in the Middle East until there's peace in Palestine. And what we're seeing is that's entirely wrong. The Arab nations are warming to Israel. They see that Israel is not this global monster and devil, and there is trade to be done. There are links to be had. There's cultural exchanges to get on with, and there can be a real peace. And this is an opportunity to reframe the way that New Zealand views this issue with the lens of reality. So
interesting. I'll put a question to you though, because there's a suggestion that that this move around peace treaties with Israel is a pragmatic one, in the sense that as much as Israel has been a very convenient straw man in the Middle East and a political tool for governments, Iran's an even bigger threat, and therefore it's important that those governments are on side with Israel and by default the United States against an increasingly belligerent Iranian threat. I mean, do you think there's any truth in that?
Yeah, of course. I mean, look, there were always a warming of relations. For a long time, there's been at least speculation of Saudi Arabia and Israel sharing intelligence for a long time. But the nuclear deal that Obama pushed through with Iran has scared the Arab states, no doubt about it. There's a clear understanding that Iran does want to get to the Mediterranean, and if they're nuclear powered and nuclear weaponized, that poses a real threat, and the Arab states know that. And so, sure, part of it is definitely a security, a realpolitik, a pragmatic approach. But what I was saying before, I think, is worthwhile pointing out that this is not just papers that were signed on outside the White House and hands that were shaken and everyone went back and now they're scrambling to try and get some fighter planes. This has really been a grassroots at the same time. The amount of love, we've seen Emiratis sing Hatikva and we've seen Israelis sing the Emirati national anthem between each other. We've seen Zoom meetings, we've seen business meetings. There are mayors of cities that are talking about exchanges. The kosher catering in the UAE hotels, the sukkah that was put up, the flags that are waving in the different countries. This is much more than just a realpolitik, pragmatic step. And the willingness of other Arab nations apparently to start to join is also a great sign. But I think beyond all of that, even if you don't want to believe that's true and you're still hanging on to the realpolitik, then it doesn't. The act of signing the agreement and acknowledging and welcoming a Jewish return to indigenous lands in Israel changes the three no's that were put forward in Khartoum, the constant rejection of Jewish self-determination over the last 70-odd years. And so it has to be something that's welcomed and something that's a little bit more than just defense, because let's face it, if it was only about defense, some of the clauses wouldn't have been put in there.
That's fair. Look, I hope you're right. I'm perhaps a little bit more of a cynic, but it's only because I'm sort of a creature of politics and have been observing this for a long time. But I absolutely hope you're right. Well, and in the fullness of time, we will know, I guess, whether or not this is real or whether or not it is indeed just a cover for something more insidious. So time will tell. David, great session this evening. I want to close just by doing what we always do, which is to remind people of our website, israelinstitute.nz. Which always carries these Israel reports. They're put up within 4 or 5 days. And so there's quite a library of them now that people can go back to and access, but also some other fantastic content. And for anybody, and I suspect it's probably not true of anybody watching at the moment, but for anybody who isn't already a subscriber to our newsletter, there's also an opportunity, obviously, to subscribe as well.
The Hague Initiative for International Cooperation.
A very important
Every language, the Israel Institute of New Zealand.
My roots come from Jerusalem.